On that crisp autumn morning, everything seemed to follow the same old routine around Roosevelt Elementary. Children ran through the dry leaves scattered across the playground, staff exchanged hurried greetings, and the distant sound of the bell echoed through the hallways like a reminder of routine. But behind that tranquil appearance, something invisible was preparing to emerge, something hidden inside a simple snack, something no one expected, except the one who dared to look more closely. 11-year-old Ethan Johnson walked with short steps and a worn backpack on his back. He was just another face in the crowd, the kind of boy who went unnoticed in class photos, who was rarely chosen for group activities, and who preferred to observe the world in silence rather than compete for space in it. And it was precisely this silent gaze, attentive to details, that made him notice what no one else saw. When he opened the lunch he'd been mistakenly given, he found something not on the menu, a note, hastily folded, hidden between two slices of bread, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. Just one sentence, but enough to make Ethan's heart race and change everything. What was written on that piece of paper was the trigger that mobilized the entire operation. It was the trigger for the police to revisit old files, for buried truths to finally be confronted, and for the town of Bronzeville to awaken from a comfortable silence that had lasted far too long. Now, surrounded by cameras, sirens, and frightened eyes, Ethan's name echoed where before there had been only silence. But to understand how this boy became the key piece in a story no one wanted to remember, we must go back. Back to before the note, before the discovery, before the invisible became impossible to ignore. If this story already has you hooked, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. The next Graveyard Tales are even more disturbing. Ethan Johnson was only 11 years old, but he already carried on his shoulders the weight of a life that demanded far more of him than it should have. He lived with his mother, Marianne, in a small wooden house on the south side of Chicago. She worked double shifts at the local supermarket, often returning home exhausted, but still trying to provide for her son. His father had disappeared from their lives before Ethan could even read, and silence on the subject had become part of the family's routine. Despite his hardships, Ethan was an attentive boy with lively eyes and a restless mind. His reserved manner drew little attention, but it was precisely in silence that he built his strength. While other boys occupied recess with noisy games, he sat in a corner of the playground with a notebook, doodling drawings or observing every detail around him. He noticed things no one else did: hidden gestures, suspicious glances, small changes that went unnoticed. At school, this didn't help him. To his teachers, he was simply distracted. To his classmates, he was a strange boy who spoke little. He was often the butt of jokes, and though he rarely responded, the words stung like invisible barbs. Deep down, he just wanted to be taken seriously, for someone to trust his attentive gaze and value his sensitivity. His routine was simple. He would wake up early, help his mother clean the kitchen, and head to Roosevelt Elementary with his worn backpack and old sneakers that no longer kept up with his growth. On the way, he always passed the same graffiti-covered block, the same shuttered storefronts, and neighbors who waved briskly. There was nothing extraordinary about his days, and perhaps that was why no one would ever have imagined something so enormous could fall upon his shoulders. That Monday morning, the sun streamed through the classroom's tall windows, reflecting off the open notebooks. Ethan sat at his desk near the wall, watching his classmates chatting in animated groups. His gaze, as always, wandered, alert to anything that seemed out of place. He had the uneasy feeling that something strange was lurking around the room, though he couldn't quite explain what. When the bell rang for recess, he walked with the others to the cafeteria. The playground was bustling with voices and movement, but it was there, amidst the noise, that his gaze fell on something seemingly insignificant: a snack abandoned on a corner table. Unlike the others, it was wrapped in crumpled aluminum foil, as if someone had hurriedly left it there. Ethan paused for a few seconds, studying the package carefully. There was something about the way it was placed that stirred a strange sensation in his chest. It didn't seem like just another forgotten snack. He didn't know it yet, but that detail would be the starting point for a sequence of events that would transform not only the school, but the entire city. What was so strange about this seemingly ordinary snack that made Ethan stop in front of it with the feeling that something wasn't right? The noise of recess filled every corner of the playground. Children chased balls, some fought for a spot on the swing, others simply laughed out loud at quick jokes. Amidst the joyful chaos, Ethan stood still, his eyes fixed on the forgotten snack on the wooden table near the cafeteria. The more he looked, the more he began to realize the package wasn't there by chance. The aluminum foil, crumpled into strange folds, stood out from the neatly wrapped packages he was used to seeing. It was as if it had been put together in a hurry, without the care a mother would normally give when preparing something for her child. He approached slowly, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. He picked up the package carefully, and the weight felt normal, but there was something different about the texture, as if it contained more than just bread and filling. Ethan turned it over in his hands, trying to understand the sensation. His heart raced, filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. With discreet steps, he walked away from the commotion and sat on a bench across the courtyard. She placed the sandwich on her lap and took a deep breath before opening the package. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the air. But what caught her attention wasn't the sandwich itself, but a thin, carelessly folded corner of paper hidden beneath the food. With trembling fingers, he pulled out the paper. It was crumpled, smeared with grease and nervous handprints. The hastily written letters were irregular and nearly illegible, but clear enough to form a short message. "Help! I'm trapped. Room B12. A shiver ran down his spine. B12. Ethan knew this room existed, but he also knew it hadn't been used in years. It was in the school's basement, a cold, forgotten hallway, locked with a heavy padlock. Some students said it was just a storage area for old materials. Others made up scary stories about the place. But no one talked about the room as real. No one even cared about it. He looked around. The children continued playing, oblivious to the weight of those words. He quickly folded the note and hid it in his pocket, afraid someone would see it. His heart hammered in his chest. It was impossible to believe it was just a joke. The lines of the letters betrayed desperation, as if the writer had risked everything to make that request. In that instant, Ethan realized he was facing something life-changing. The question was inevitable. Who had written it? And why choose to hide it inside a school lunch? Ethan now carries a heavy secret in his pocket. But what will happen when he tries to share his discovery and realizes no one is willing to believe him? The note seemed to pulse inside Ethan's pocket, as if it had a life of its own. He tried to follow the science class, but the teacher's every word was lost in the sound of his racing heart. The image of those trembling letters wouldn't leave his mind, etched like fire in his memory. When the bell announced the end of class, he stood up so quickly his chair nearly toppled over. In the hallway, he walked quickly until he found Professor Clark, who was gathering some books from her locker. He approached her with the paper in his hand, hesitant but determined. "Mrs. Clark, I found this," he said, holding out the note with trembling hands. She took it with a puzzled expression. Her eyes quickly scanned the written lines. For a moment she frowned, as if she were about to become genuinely worried. But then she sighed, folding the paper haphazardly and handing it back to the boy. "Ethan, this is just a practical joke. Probably some student was trying to play a prank on the others. There's nothing to worry about. He tried to protest, to explain how the note had appeared under a sandwich, but the teacher was already walking away, carrying her books with firm steps. When he realized he was alone in the hallway, his stomach tightened into a knot. Once again, no one believed him. Back in the classroom, his classmates noticed his distressed expression and began to mock him. "The storyteller has another one of them said loudly, drawing laughter from the class. Ethan lowered his eyes, stuffing the note back into his pocket, swallowing his shame and anger. But beneath the humiliation, something was growing in his chest. It was a mixture of fear and determination. If no one would listen, then he would have to act alone. He looked out the window and saw the empty courtyard. Already enveloped in the shadows of dusk, he felt a shiver as he remembered Room B12, forgotten in the school's basement, like a wound covered in dust. The note was still in his hands, and the more he stared at it, the more he felt those words couldn't be ignored. "Help! I'm under arrest. Room B12. There was desperation there. There was truth. And no matter how much they tried to convince him it was just a prank, he knew he had to find out what was hidden behind that message. As the bell rang, to announce the end of the day, Ethan tucked the paper into the bottom of his backpack and walked slowly out of the room. His mind was buzzing with questions, and his entire body vibrated with alert. If no one believed him, he would have to find his own answers. Ethan carries alone the weight of a discovery everyone prefers to ignore. But what will happen when, even trying to prove the truth, he's treated like a dreamy boy who sees mystery where none exists? Ethan left the classroom quickly, the note hidden deep in his backpack. The hallway was nearly empty, only a few students lingering to put their books away in their lockers. He felt a surge of urgency building within him, as if the words scrawled on the paper were a scream trapped in his own throat. He needed to persist. He needed someone to believe. He stopped in front of the teacher's lounge, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. Inside, two adults were talking quietly while the principal organized papers on the desk. Ethan walked in slowly, backpack clutched to his chest, and caught her eye. "Principal, I found this today at recess. It's serious. Someone needs to see it." He took out the note and held it out with sweaty hands. The principal adjusted her glasses, read the scribbled words, and raised her eyebrows. For a moment she looked surprised, even worried. But then she handed the paper back to the boy with a forced smile. "Ethan, we shouldn't allow this kind of pranking. You know how creative some students are to get attention. But it wasn't a joke, I swear. I found it in a snack," he insisted, his voice breaking. The director's tone hardened. "Enough, Ethan. We don't have time for made-up stories. Go home." The words fell on him like stones. His eyes stung, but he swallowed back his tears. He put the note back and left silently, hearing muffled laughter from the other teachers who had witnessed the scene. Humiliation burned more than fear. On the way home, he kicked pebbles along the asphalt, his head down. With every step, he repeated the phrase from the note in his mind. The feeling that someone needed him was so strong it made him tremble. How could they not notice? How could they simply dismiss it as a prank? That night, lying in his narrow bed, he could hear his mother's footsteps moving quickly through the kitchen before her next work shift. He wanted to tell her, but held back. Marianne was already carrying the burden of supporting them both alone. He didn't want to add more worries to her exhausting routine, so he kept the secret, even though his heart urged him otherwise. The hours passed slowly. The wind blew through the poorly sealed window, and Ethan couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those blurred letters before him. It was impossible to ignore. If no one believed him, he would have to find out for himself. When dawn broke, he got up with determination. He grabbed his backpack, tucked the note into one of the inside pockets, and left for school. There was something different in his eyes, a mixture of fear and courage, as if he had finally understood that he needed to act alone. As he walked through the halls that day, every detail seemed to carry a new meaning. The creak of the old door, the echoing footsteps on the polished floor, even the heavy silence that dominated the lower floors of the school. It was as if everything around him was trying to warn him that he was about to enter dangerous territory. Ethan knew he couldn't wait any longer. The time had come to follow the clues in the note, even if he was the only one willing to believe it. If no one was by his side, Ethan would have to face the dark corridors of the school alone. But what exactly awaited him behind the forgotten door of Room B12? The sun had already set behind the buildings when Ethan returned to school that afternoon. His heart beat faster with each step he took toward the side gate, used only by staff. He knew he was breaking the rules. But he also knew no one else would do what he was about to do. The note remained in the inside pocket of his backpack, folded so many times that it already showed small tears. Crossing the empty courtyard was like walking through unfamiliar territory. Without the noise of children and teachers, the school felt like a different place, with elongated shadows and corridors that resembled silent mazes. Ethan pushed open the heavy door that led to the basement and felt the cold air rush up his legs. The smell of mold and old paint filled his nostrils, causing an involuntary shiver. He descended the steps slowly, the sound of his footsteps echoing like screams in the silence. The underground corridor was dimly lit, with ancient lamps that flickered occasionally. He ran his fingers along the damp walls, trying to orient himself, until he found the rusty door with the faded inscription B12. For a moment he stood motionless before her. The note in his mind repeated the same sentence. "Help! I'm trapped. Room B12." Ethan pressed his ear to the cold surface of the door, but all he heard was the muffled sound of his own heartbeat. Doubt gnawed at him. Was it really true? Or was he risking everything for a cruel lie? Carefully, he took his old cell phone from his backpack. The camera trembled in his hands as he began recording. The dim beam of the flashlight illuminated the rust-covered doorknob. He pushed, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked with a thick, rusty, but sturdy padlock. Ethan touched it, and a cold sensation ran through his fingers. It was then that he heard something, a low, almost imperceptible sound coming from inside the room. It wasn't wind. It was as if someone had tapped lightly on the wall. Ethan took a step back, his heart racing. He waited in silence, and the sound came again, this time louder, like a brief thud. Startled, he looked around, but the hallway remained empty. He gripped his cell phone tighter and approached the door again. He murmured a barely audible, "Is anyone there?" as if afraid of his own voice. There was no clear answer, only a light, continuous scratching like nails against wood. The boy recorded the sound, trembling. He needed proof. He needed to show he wasn't making this up. He filmed the door, the padlock, the empty hallway, and put his phone back in his backpack. The fear was real, but the feeling that someone was trapped inside was even greater. As he started back up the steps, a metallic click echoed behind him. The padlock had jangled on its own, as if someone had touched it from within. Ethan bolted down the hallway, hurrying up the stairs. He stepped out into the courtyard, breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his forehead despite the night chill. In that instant, he knew there was no turning back. He couldn't pretend he didn't know. Room B12 hid something terrible, and he was the only one who had seen the clues. As he walked home that night, he kept telling himself he needed to find out more. The note wasn't a fabrication. The rattling padlock, the muffled sounds, and the heavy underground air were too much evidence to ignore. Ethan didn't know it yet, but with every step he took, someone was already watching him in the shadows, following his movements closely. What will Ethan find when he decides to go back and put new pieces of this puzzle together? And who is the hidden figure that begins to emerge in his life at that moment? The next morning, Ethan arrived at school a different person. He carried in his eyes the memory of Dr. B12, the muffled sound coming from inside and the jingling of the padlock. He knew he couldn't stop there. With every step through the hallways, I sensed the school hid secrets breathing behind the peeling walls. During class, he kept his phone in his pocket, mentally reviewing the recordings from the night before. He imagined the moment he would show it to someone, but the thought of Professor Clark and the principal discouraged him. They wouldn't believe him. He needed more. He needed something impossible to ignore. During break, instead of heading to the courtyard, he detoured to the library. It was a nearly forgotten place, with tall bookshelves and dust accumulated on books no one had touched in years. Ethan rummaged through the old archives, the old newspapers stacked in boxes in the corner. I was looking for any clue, any mention of Room B12. It took a while, but he found it. A yellowed newspaper clipping dated 1997 spoke of missing children near the school. No cases had been solved. Next to it, another article described the closure of some areas of the building for renovations and security. Among them was the basement where Room B12 was located. Ethan's heart raced. It wasn't a coincidence. His hands trembled as he folded the clipping and tucked it away with the note. The forgotten room, the padlock, the plea for help. It all seemed to fit together into a macabre puzzle no one had dared solve. That afternoon, when the corridors were empty, he returned to the basement. The cold air enveloped him again, and each footstep echoed like a warning. He stopped again in front of door B12, this time more attentive. He listened for a few seconds, and the silence seemed absolute until a distant sound mingled with the flickering of the lamps. A low, muffled murmur, like a voice. A tightness gripped his chest. He pressed his ear closer and swore he heard a brief cry, interrupted by the scraping of wood. He recoiled in fright, but before he could run, something made his blood run cold. At the end of the hallway, standing in the shadows, was the janitor, Mr. Miller. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a fixed gaze, Miller watched silently. Ethan couldn't tell how long he'd been there, but the discomfort was immediate. The man approached slowly, and with each step, the air seemed heavier. "What are you doing here, boy?" The voice was firm, almost sharp. Ethan swallowed, trying to hide the newspaper he was holding. He mumbled some excuse, saying he was just lost. The janitor's gaze, however, didn't waver from his hands. For a moment, the silence between them felt like hours. Miller stepped forward and said in a low tone, "This place is not for you. Never come back here." Ethan ran without looking back, climbing the stairs as fast as he could. His heart felt like it was bursting in his chest, but at the same time, a certainty grew in his mind. The janitor knew something. He wasn't just guarding the school. He was keeping a secret. By the time he reached the courtyard, his breathing was labored, but determination was already etched in his eyes. There was no doubt now. The cry for help was real. The room hid something terrible, and Mr. Miller was at the center of it all. Ethan discovered he wasn't just dealing with a forgotten note, but with someone determined to silence him. What will happen when danger finally knocks on his door? The night felt longer than any other Ethan had ever experienced. He tossed and turned in bed, unable to find a restful position, while the image of Mr. Miller loomed over and over in his mind, like a menacing shadow that wouldn't disappear, even when he tried to squeeze his eyes shut. The warning the man had given in the dark hallway echoed inside his head like a relentless hammer. Never come back here. And as real and suffocating as the fear was, there was something even stronger that kept him awake. The conviction that behind that door B12 There was someone who desperately needed to be heard. The next morning, his steps toward school were heavier than usual, and yet there was a strange mixture of dread and courage in his chest, as if each beat of his heart were a reminder that the choice to continue was not just a matter of childish curiosity, but a calling he could not ignore. During the first few classes, he tried to focus on his notebooks and the voices of his teachers, but it was impossible. The feeling of being watched followed him like a silent shadow, and with every movement he made within the classroom, he seemed to feel Miller's eyes fixed on him, even if he could not actually see them. When the bell rang for recess, Ethan walked away from the cafeteria and sought refuge in a secluded corner near the gym, discreetly removing from his backpack the notes he'd made about the note and the newspaper clippings he'd found. He was so absorbed that he didn't notice the approach until he felt a firm hand land on his shoulder. He turned slowly, his stomach knotting, and found himself face to face with the imposing figure of Mr. Miller. The man, with his rigid expression and narrowed eyes, leaned in until their faces were inches apart, and in a low, almost menacing whisper, said he'd already given the warning and wouldn't tolerate seeing him prowling the basement corridors again. The boy tried to stammer out an apology, but the words came out broken and weak. The janitor, squeezing Ethan's shoulder with painful pressure, coldly reinforced that if he disobeyed again, he would face consequences he couldn't escape. Then he suddenly released him and walked away, leaving only the echo of his heavy footsteps echoing in the hallway. Ethan remained motionless for a few seconds, his legs trembling, feeling short of breath, but also with the strange certainty that this threat, rather than stopping him, only increased his need to continue. That same day, as classes ended and the hallways emptied, Ethan took a deep breath and decided to return to the basement. He crossed the school silently, making sure no one was watching him, and descended the narrow stairs with his cell phone in hand, the dim flashlight illuminating only a few feet ahead. The cold, damp air enveloped him again, and with each step, the weight of the darkness seemed to push him back, as if the building itself were trying to stop him. When he reached the door to Room B12, he approached cautiously and recorded images of the padlock, the faded inscription on the wood and the surrounding area, capturing any details that might serve as evidence. However, before he could finish, a sharp thud echoed behind him. The boy spun around quickly, and the flashlight beam revealed Miller's silhouette emerging from the end of the hallway, his face hardened with rage, an iron key gleaming in his hand. The man's voice filled the narrow space like a subdued thunder, asking what Ethan hadn't understood at the first warning. Panicked, the boy ran instinctively, hearing the janitor's heavy footsteps behind him growing closer. He nearly stumbled up the steps, his chest burning with lack of air, and on the last flight, he felt Miller's presence reaching for him, his hand ready to grab his backpack. With a desperate effort, he threw himself forward, narrowly escaping, and crossed the upper corridor to the side exit. Now on the street, breathing heavily, he realized he'd dropped his cell phone during his escape. However, he remembered the recording had been saved moments earlier, containing the sound of knocking on door B12 and proof that something or someone was moving inside. Between fear and exhaustion, a certainty was etched within him. Miller wasn't just a stern caretaker, but the guardian of a dark secret that must never be revealed. Now that Ethan carries with him fragments of evidence and the memory of a chase that nearly cost him dearly, what will happen when this evidence is finally revealed? And the town must face a truth it would rather continue to ignore. That night, Ethan returned home exhausted, but he couldn't relax. He sat at the kitchen table with his backpack open in front of him, took out the note and the newspaper clippings, and checked his phone, relieved to find the file still there, saved from before the crash. When he pressed play, the sound echoed through the small room. Metallic knocks, scratches, and a muffled murmur that sent shivers down his spine. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling like this recording was his only chance to prove he wasn't making anything up. The next day, as he left for school, he made a different decision. Instead of showing the note again to teachers who had already mocked him, he sought out his neighbor 2 houses down, Officer Daniels, known for being strict but fair. He found him washing his car in the garage and, with a still shaky voice, told him everything he had discovered. The snack, the note, Room B12, the recorded sound on his cell phone, and even the janitor's pursuit. Daniels was initially skeptical, but as soon as he heard the recorded sounds, his expression changed. Seriousness took over, and he asked Ethan to hand over the clippings and the note. That same night, patrol cars were discreetly dispatched to Roosevelt Elementary. The sound of their engines igniting aroused the curiosity of neighbors who began to gather on the sidewalks. Ethan, hidden behind his fence, watched with his heart racing. The previously silent school came to life, with armed officers coming and going, spotlights illuminating the windows, and radios blaring with urgent orders. Soon after, the news spread. Reporters appeared in front of the main gate, microphones in hand, trying to capture any information. Terrified parents arrived, asking if their children were safe, and the crowd soon became a sea of agitated voices. Everyone wanted to know what was inside Room B12. When the first boxes were finally brought out, carried by 2 police officers, the shocked expressions on their faces spoke volumes. They were children's old belongings, sketchbooks, torn backpacks, broken dolls, and dusty children's clothes. The murmur of the crowd turned into a clamor of disbelief. Some parents screamed, others cried, and the cameras recorded every detail with incessant flashes. Ethan watched from afar, his chest filled with a mixture of relief and fear. He had succeeded. No one could deny the truth anymore. The note wasn't a fabrication, and his insistence on going alone to that basement had now exposed a secret that shook the entire town. But amidst the revelation, one thought wouldn't leave him alone. If those boxes were there, if so many objects had been found, what else was hidden behind that door? And more importantly, was anyone still alive, waiting for help? The police operation had just begun, but the true proof that the call for help was still real would only come to light at the most dramatic moment. Who was trapped inside Room B12? The school doors were smashed open with a bang, the metallic clang echoing through the hallways like thunder, awakening the slumbering ghosts of the place. Police officers advanced in formation, guided by spotlights and the rustle of their boots against the polished floor, descending the narrow stairs that led to the basement. The air seemed heavier with each step, as if the entire building were trying to hide the truth behind its moldy walls. Ethan, hidden among the onlookers outside, watched the blue and red lights reflect off the windows and felt his heart pound in his throat, unable to control his anxiety. Downstairs, in front of door B12, the agents came across the rusty padlock. One of the officers raised the hydraulic pliers and forcefully broke the corroded metal. The sharp screech echoed through the corridor, followed by a deathly silence. Everyone looked at each other before pushing the door open. When it finally gave way, stale. Air escaped like a breath of forgotten decades, bringing with it the smell of mold and something else, an odor no one wanted to identify. The flashlights illuminated the room, revealing a horrific scene. Old mattresses lay on the floor, rusty chains were attached to the walls, and the remains of objects were scattered about. Children's shoes, broken toy boxes, and pieces of wood scratched with names nearly erased by time. In the background, covered by a filthy blanket, a figure moved. The officers quickly advanced and lifted the cloth, revealing a girl of about 12, thin, with huge eyes filled with terror. She tried to speak, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper. One of the officers carried her in his arms, while others shouted orders into the radio, requesting an ambulance and immediate backup. The hallway was filled with a rush of footsteps and shouts, and the news reached the surface within seconds. Outside, journalists were broadcasting live, and the crowd erupted in shock and tears when they learned that a live child had been found inside the school. Ethan felt his entire body shiver. The note hadn't just revealed a forgotten secret. Someone was surviving in that dark basement. If he hadn't persisted, if he hadn't pushed himself to the limit, that girl might never have been saved. The weight of this realization crashed over him like a wave, but at the same time, it brought new strength, the certainty that he hadn't been mistaken. As the girl was loaded into the ambulance, Mr. Miller was handcuffed before the cameras, his face rigid with unrepentance. The crowd chanted for justice, flashbulbs illuminated every detail, and the entire city watched as a secret that had remained hidden for years unraveled. The next morning, Roosevelt Elementary didn't look like the same school. Yellow tape surrounded the schoolyard, the gates were occupied by reporters and cameras, and the entire town seemed to have turned its gaze to the red brick building that, until then, had been just another neighborhood school. Amidst the hustle and bustle, Ethan walked silently, backpack strapped to his back and head down, trying to blend in. But there was no hiding the weight of everything that had happened. Inside the auditorium, students, teachers, and parents gathered to hear the first official statements. The principal, pale and visibly shaken, took the floor at the microphone. She spoke about the investigation, the courage of the police officers, and then paused, taking a deep breath before admitting what seemed to weigh like a weight on her shoulders. If it weren't for Ethan Johnson, none of this would have been discovered. Silence fell over the room, and all eyes turned to the boy who remained seated in the last row, hunched over, as if unsure what to do with the sudden attention. Marianne, his mother, stood beside him, her eyes welling up, her hand clasped tightly in his, proud and moved. Gradually, they began to applaud. At first, timidly, then louder and louder, until the entire auditorium was filled with the sound of applause that echoed like a belated but genuine recognition. Teachers who had previously called him a dreamer stood up. Classmates who had laughed at him lowered their heads. And even Mrs. Clark, the teacher who had discarded the note, approached with tears in her eyes, apologizing softly, barely able to face him. Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her, then at his colleagues, and then lowered his eyes again. He didn't need medals or grand speeches. What he'd wanted from the beginning was simple, that someone had believed. Despite the recognition, something still weighed on his mind. The girl had been rescued, but the boxes found in the basement showed that this was no isolated secret. There were other names crossed out, other stories buried in the dust, and more than that, the memory of the note wouldn't leave him alone. If someone had managed to send that distress message, how many more might be waiting to be discovered? The following days passed in a blur for Ethan. Though his name was repeated in newspapers, on television broadcasts, and in neighborhood conversations, he still carried within himself the silence that had always accompanied him. That late afternoon, sitting on the school bus seat, he watched the streets of Chicago pass before his eyes through the window, each one tinged with the golden light of sunset. The children chattered excitedly behind him, discussing video games. But Ethan remained quiet, as if carrying within his thoughts something far greater than his age could bear. The cold glass against his forehead brought back memories in waves. The door to room B12, the muffled sound coming from inside, the frightened eyes of the rescued girl, Mr. Miller's stern look as he was led away in handcuffs. It all seemed so real, as if it were happening again before him. Ethan knew that, even though the town considered the case closed, for him, nothing was truly over. The boxes of children's belongings, the names scratched into ancient walls, and the simple fact that someone had managed to write that note proved there were still unanswered questions. As the bus rounded a bend, something caught his eye. On the floor, between the rows of seats, a folded piece of paper lay, as if someone had forgotten it. Ethan bent down, picked it up carefully, and slowly unfolded it. His heart raced instantly. It was just a regular notebook page, but on it was a word written in haste, the letters shaky and marked with urgency. The word was short, but enough to chill his entire body. Help. Ethan closed his hand around the paper and looked out the window again. The city was still bustling, cars honking, people hurried along the sidewalks, completely oblivious to the weight of this discovery. He took a deep breath, aware that the story wasn't over, and that perhaps he was only at the beginning of something even darker. He was only an 11-year-old boy, but he had already changed the destiny of an entire city. And now, that same destiny seemed to be calling him again, as if new doors were about to open before his watchful eyes. If you've been hooked on this story this far, it's because it spoke directly to you. So don't forget, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and stay tuned for the next chapters. There are many hidden stories waiting to be revealed, and you won't want to miss what's to come.